The wind that came down off the high ridge had a wire's bite humming through cottonwoods until the leaves shivered like coins. Lucas Hale stood on the porch boards that had learned his waistcoat unbuttoned to the cold, as if daring it to do the work grief had not. He looked past the paddock and corrals to where the mountains wore dusk like a bruise, and he let the ache in his chest name itself without words. 3 winters had gone by since a fever swept the camp and took Ruth and her boy Eli. 3 winters since he dug in frozen dirt with hands that bled until the ground agreed to open. Since then he had stacked ledgers like walls and bought grass, like a man buying distance. But distance was quick, and walls are lonely. The big house on the Hale spread held rugs from Denver mirrors with carved edges, books that knew stories he never opened, and a silence that learned every hallway by heart. A figure appeared at the doorway, careful and small, as if the air itself might crack. Miriam Clark, new to the place, less than a month brought on a freight day when the platform was all steam and instructions. Her shoes had been too thin for Wyoming mud, and her voice thinner still an Ohio whisper that apologized for taking up inches. She worked like a prayer that wanted no witnesses. He had noticed the house felt tidier, not just in the way things were placed, but in the way rooms seemed to hold themselves after she left like a heartbeat evening out. "Supper is ready, Mr. Hale," she said, hands in the shawl's ends. "Beef and onions, fresh loaf. Would you like the dining room or the office?" "The office," he said. "Numbers weight worse than cattle." "Yes, sir." She dipped a small curtsy. He disliked a ceremony that made him feel like furniture and slid away. In the office, the fire spoke low and competent. The great oak desk had grooves where pens had fought winters. Lucas bent to columns, feet in salt and wages, the notched future of a bull in Denver he intended to bring home and make the valley answer to. Above the desk hung a framed sketch, Ruth kneeling to tie a rag around Eli's scraped knee. A traveling artist had drawn it from a story Lucas told twice and then could not bear to tell again. The sketch gave Ruth's hand a steadiness that hurt to look at, and it gave Eli a mouth trying not to cry, that reminded Lucas of the first day he taught the boy to sit a pony. Miriam came in carrying the tray like a message that did not want to burden anyone. She set down the stew and the folded cloth around the bread, the glass of water squared to the plate, every line respectful of the surface it touched. Her eyes lifted and snagged on the sketch. "She looks like she always knew where to touch so pain would go quiet," she said, and then colored, as if she had spoken inside someone else's house. "She did," Lucas answered. "I will return for the tray," Miriam said, and left the room as if closing a book without breaking the spine. He ate because men eat when they mean to keep going. He signed 2 contracts and read no pages. When the lines began to tilt, he pushed back from the desk, stood, and went for water. The hallway turned him into a listener. From the kitchen came a voice, soft and even, moving through the quiet like a hand smoothing a sheet. He stopped with his back to the wall because sometimes you stop when something true is about to step into the open. Miriam was at the basin, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the lamp ringed by a modest halo. She talked in that way. People talk when the words have to be put somewhere, or they will turn heavy. "Tomorrow I'll take the parlor curtains down and wash them," she murmured. "Even if they look fine, water makes a room lighter. The silver could do with another rub, though Mrs. Kettle says it's a waste. It's not for the shine only. It's for the feeling that your hands can bring a thing back toward what it was meant to be." The dishwater hushed and sang. "No crying, Miriam Marie," she said to herself, using the middle name like a stern aunt. "You have a roof and wages." Some girls from the train cried until their eyes swelled. "Mr. Hale is fair. He looks at rooms like they owe him an answer, but he is fair." Lucas felt something in his chest loosen a kind of knot he had taken for the shape of his heart. He slipped back to the office and let the fire burn low. Not to test her, not yet, but to see whether the house spoke differently when he did not. The next night he let his body make the curve of sleep, head back, arms, slack breath, even. Miriam came on the small sound of her steps. The tray lifted, the tray set down. Her hands hovered, then chose. She drew the blanket from the chair and laid it over his shoulders with a touch that knew weight could be a kindness. "Poor man," she whispered, not with pity, but with knowledge. "You can work a whole year clean through, and it won't buy 1 minute back." She crouched at the hearth, coaxed a quiet blaze out of the sullen wood. She stood before the sketch. "I hope you're resting wherever you are," she told Ruth in a voice that had tried that hope on itself before. When she turned away, she set a small tin by the ledger. "For your hands," she said. "Beeswax and pine and a little tallow. My mama made it through winters back home. It helps the cracks to mind their manners." He did not open his eyes. When the door closed, he turned. The tin lifted the lid and touched 2 fingers to the salve. The smell was clean and honest. The wax sank into the broken places with the patience of a good teacher. The relief made him angry in a way that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the years he had pretended pain meant he was properly atoning. The anger cooled into something else, a recognition he could not name without breaking it. On the third evening, he found he needed the sound of her truth, as a man who has crossed dust needs to hear water. He let his head back again, and Miriam came tidying the already tidy setting a log so the fire would not lapse, lining the pencil with the paper's edge as if promising the desk at work would not go wild. She spoke about flour tasting different in winter, about the parlor chair near the east window catching morning kinder than the west, about a girl on the train who had hands that shook from the inside and laughed like she was paying a debt. Before the sketch, she said softer than a prayer, "I lost someone too." She said no more, and Lucas, who had learned the hard way that grief is a country with borders, did not cross. On the 7th night, she came with fever standing behind her, like a shadow that did not belong to the lamp. She set the tray down, swayed, blinked hard like a horse refusing a bad jump, and reached for the chair back. "Finish the chores," she whispered to herself. "Be useful." When she stumbled, Lucas let the false sleep drop off his body like a shed skin. He was across the room in 3 long steps, catching her elbows the instant her knees forgot their brief. "Sit," he said, and it was the kind of word that knows it will be obeyed. Mrs. Kettle arrived on the clack of her shoes, fingers already counting remedies. "Fever and no meat on her bones," she declared. "I'll send young Tom for Dr. Morgan." Miriam tried to stand. "Please don't," she said, fear edging the words. "If she thinks I can't work, I will not have you proving you deserve a bed by almost dying in it," Lucas said, surprising himself with the sound of his own care. The doctor came with midnight eyebrows and a bag that had learned many stubborn cases. "Exhaustion, thin meals, overwork," he said. "Rest broth, blankets, and a boss who remembers he is a man before he is an owner." When the room settled again, Lucas stood beside the small bed in the back corner, the tin of wax in his palm. Miriam slept because orders and the body's collapse finally matched. "I owe you an apology," he said when her eyes opened later and found him. "For pretending, for listening." She pressed her hands to hot cheeks. "You heard me say foolish things." "Not foolish," he said. "True. And I have been starving for true." The fever broke slow like a thaw that begins with the sound of drops somewhere you cannot see. By the second morning, Miriam's skin was cooler, though her strength was thin as paper. She tried to rise apology already on her lips, but Lucas pressed her back with a palm firm and gentle. "Dr. Morgan said another day," he told her, "and I reckon the man's earned the right to be obeyed." Her gray eyes flickered with protest, then dimmed into a reluctant nod. "I don't want to be a burden. A burden is something you carry that was never yours to begin with," Lucas answered. "You are not that." Mrs. Kettle bustled in with broth and bread, her scolding tongue sharp but her hands soft. "Girl nearly worked herself into the grave," she muttered. "And for what? To prove she can hold her place in a house already grateful for her." She left them with the tray, the scent of onions and thyme lingering. Lucas sat watching Miriam sip slowly, each swallow a victory. He had never thought a kitchen bowl could look like salvation. Yet here it was, steam rising between them like a truce. As days lengthened, Miriam's strength returned. She moved from bed to chair, sewing, with fingers that trembled less each hour. Lucas found reasons to pass by to ask whether the fire was too warm or if she preferred more light. She would look up startled, as if being asked her opinion was a currency she'd never spent. One afternoon he lingered longer. She had laid a scrap of blue cloth across her lap, needle flashing like a captured star. "That color suits you," he said before he thought better. She blinked, cheeks coloring, and bent lower over the cloth. "It was Mama's," she whispered. "I carry pieces so I don't forget." The valley noticed changes. Cowhands spoke of a new ease in the house of Lucas Hale, smiling where once his face had been stone. In town, whispers grew sharp. Some said the maid had wit enough to climb, that the richest rancher for miles was letting loneliness blind him. Others kinder thought it good a man buried in sorrow might find his way back by a girl's steady hands. The words reached Miriam. She carried them like stones in her apron. At church she felt eyes on her back at the mercantile, the chatter bent whenever she entered. Her instinct was flight. She had left Ohio under the same cloud when her papa's debts turned neighbors' kindness to scorn. Lucas did not miss the tightness in her shoulders or the way her voice thinned. He bided his time until the Merrick's winter dance, a barn lit with lanterns against February dark. Miriam stood near the wall, hands clasped, a blue dress simple as dawn. Boys watched her uncertain, their courage dampened by her reserve. Lucas crossed the floor, his boots deliberate. "Would you dance with me?" he asked. Her eyes widened, panic quick in the gray. "I shouldn't? Everyone will stare." "They already do," he said, voice low and steady. "Let them stare at something worth the looking." She placed her hand in his, light as a secret. At first her steps faltered, her body stiff as though bracing for ridicule. But his grip was patient, his lead surer, and gradually her shoulders eased. Then came a sound that startled the crowd, a laugh bright and unguarded from the quiet girl no one thought had laughter left. It rolled through the barn like sunlight, where winter had sat too long. Heads turned, mouths stilled. Lucas felt it in his chest like the thaw of ice long locked. Not all were pleased. Warren Pike, deputy in title if not in soul, smirked from the corner. When the song ended, he raised his voice so all could hear. "Mighty bold of a rancher to court the help," he said, "and mighty quick of the help to court him back." Silence cracked sharp and brittle. Miriam froze, her hand slipping from Lucas's. Shame rose in her like a tide. Lucas turned, eyes steady on Warren. "Kindness isn't a currency you get to count," he said, tones soft but edged like steel. "Mind your own debts before you weigh mine." The barn breathed again. The fiddles stuttered, then caught, and Lucas led Miriam outside into the cold night, where stars burned hard above them. She shivered, but not from the air. "I can't let you ruin yourself," she whispered. "I can't be the reason tongues cut you down." He took her hands, rough palms enclosing her finer ones. "Ruth and Eli are in the ground," he said, voice raw. "For years I've lived for what people thought, and it gave me nothing but silence. You gave me back breath. I won't let gossip take that." Her tears glimmered, caught between fear and longing. Then the storm came, not of words but of sky. A blizzard roared down from the ridge, bearing fences, driving cattle to huddle or scatter. Lucas saddled before dawn, his voice clipped. "Keep the fires lit. If I'm not back by night, send for the riders." He did not look at Miriam, for if he did, he might not ride. Snow swallowed him. Hours later, his horse returned, lathered and riderless, saddle rime with ice. Miriam saw the shape in the storm stagger toward the house, half-frozen hands pale as wax. She flung the kitchen door wide, dragging him in with strength, born of terror. "Not you," she cried, chafing his hands, pressing broth past lips that barely opened. "Not like this. Not when you've just begun to live again." Mrs. Kettle worked beside her, barking orders. But it was Miriam who held Lucas's head, who whispered him back from the edge. "You're home," she murmured, fierce and steady. "You're safe. Stay with me." He slipped into blackness, with her voice coiled around him like a rope. When dawn rose pale, Lucas opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was Miriam in a chair by his bed, her hands still locked with his, her body bent with exhaustion, but her face calm in sleep. For the first time in years, he felt the truth of being alive. Lucas healed slower than the doctor liked, but faster than he had any right to. And through it all, Miriam remained a constant presence, as if the fever had burned away the last of her hesitation. She nursed him with broth and poultices, checked the fire-trimmed wicks, and when she thought him asleep, she whispered prayers into the room. Sometimes they were for him, sometimes for herself, and once he caught the faint murmur of Eli's name, as though she were speaking to the boy he had lost. When he stirred, her gray eyes met his with a mixture of guilt and resolve. "I didn't mean to speak out of turn," she said softly. "The dead deserve to be remembered," Lucas replied, voice hoarse but steady, "especially by those who never knew them. It means they still live." For 3 days he lay confined, his body aching from the storm's cruelty, yet his heart stirred with a strange, new warmth. He watched Miriam move about the room with quiet determination, every gesture a reminder that care was not weakness but strength. The tin of wax sat on his nightstand, a symbol of her small but profound kindness. He would catch her glancing at it as if embarrassed by the intimacy of such a gift, but he kept it near his fingers, brushing it in the dark hours when pain threatened to drag him under again. When at last he could rise and walk, the house felt different. The silence that once haunted its halls was softened by her presence, her humming as she swept the faint sound of her laughter when Mrs. Kettle scolded her for fussing over the silver. Lucas began to linger in rooms he had long avoided: the parlor, the kitchen, even the library, whose books had gathered dust since Ruth's passing. He found reasons to speak to Miriam, to ask her thoughts on small things: the placement of flowers, the pattern of the curtains, whether the calves looked healthy in the far pasture. At first she answered with caution, as though each word might be judged, but gradually her replies grew more certain, colored by a wisdom beyond her years. One afternoon he discovered her mending a shirt by the window, sunlight painting her face in gold. He paused in the doorway, watching until she looked up, startled. "Mr. Hale," she said quickly, rising as if caught trespassing. "Lucas," he corrected gently. Her lips parted, eyes wide. "I couldn't. You've cared for me more honestly than anyone has in years," he interrupted. "If anyone has the right to use my name, it's you." She whispered it, then barely audible, but it was the sweetest sound he had heard in a long time. As winter loosened its grip, the valley prepared for spring, and with it came the Merrick's barn dance. Music and laughter filled the night, fiddles, sharp boots stomping, lanterns glowing against the dark. Lucas stood at the edge, his wealth marking him as separate even among neighbors. But then he saw Miriam, her plain blue dress glowing in his eyes, brighter than silk. She stood alone, hands clasped, her posture uncertain. Without hesitation, Lucas crossed the floor and offered his hand. "Would you grant me this dance?" She shook her head quickly. "No, sir. I couldn't. Everyone will stare." "Let them," he said simply. "The only eyes that matter are mine." She relented, her hand trembling in his, and he guided her onto the floor. At first her steps faltered, her body stiff, but his steady lead gave her confidence. Soon she was laughing, a sound so pure it turned every head in the barn. Whispers rose, not all kind, but Lucas heard nothing but her laughter, saw nothing but her eyes shining with a joy that made the years of grief fall away. When the song ended, she tried to pull back, but he held her hand, asking softly one more. She nodded, and they danced again, their movements in rhythm, not just with the music, but with something deeper, something binding. But gossip is a cruel dance of its own. Tongues wagged across the valley, the richest rancher and the maid. Some accused Miriam of ambition, others pitied Lucas for weakness. The weight of it pressed hard on her shoulders. She began to shrink again, voice small, eyes downcast. One night, unable to bear the whispers, she packed a small bag and crept to the door. But Lucas was already there, waiting in the shadows of the hall. "You were leaving," he said quietly. She flinched, tears brimming. "I can't bring shame to your name. They say I'm reaching above my station, that I'm nothing more than let them talk." Lucas cut in firmly. "I've lived too long for appearances, for respectability, and it left me empty. You brought me back to life. I won't lose that because of gossip." Her tears spilled freely. "You deserve someone your equal." "I already found her," he said, stepping closer, taking her trembling hands. "My equal isn't measured in wealth or land. It's measured in heart. And yours is stronger than anyone I've ever known." She gasped softly, the truth in his words breaking through her fear. "Lucas." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though anchoring himself to the only thing that mattered. "Stay," he whispered. "Not as a maid, but as my partner. My wife." She buried her face against his chest, sobbing quietly, but through the tears came a whispered yes. The wedding was simple, held beneath the cottonwood trees where Ruth and Eli rested. Lucas spoke their names softly before the vows, asking their blessing. The wind stirred the branches gently as if answering. Miriam wore a plain white dress, her hands trembling as they clasped his. When the preacher declared them husband and wife, Lucas kissed her with the promise of a new beginning. The valley still whispered, but he no longer cared. He was whole again. Spring pushed the snow back into the high gullies, and the valley breathed green again. Calves staggered on uncertain legs. Wildflowers dotted the meadows and the streams sang their thawing hymn. Lucas Hale, once a man locked inside grief's silence, found himself looking at each dawn as if it were a letter addressed to him personally. The ranch bustled, the house grew warmer, and Miriam no longer. The shy maid walked its halls, not with ownership, but with presence. She still kept her hands busy, still fussed over curtains and silver, but there was a steadiness in her shoulders now, a quiet strength that spoke of belonging. She was wife-partner equal, though the valley might take longer to admit it. The first weeks of their marriage held a fragile sweetness, like glass warmed by the sun. Lucas would find excuses to watch her mending by the window, arranging flowers in the parlor, or reading by lamplight with her lips moving silently. Once he caught her humming a lullaby, the tune soft and aching. "My mama sang it," she explained when she noticed him listening. She said even broken things can rest when sung to. Lucas reached for her hand. "Then keep singing," he whispered. "I've been broken a long time, but peace is never without its tests." Rumors did not die after the vows. If anything, they sharpened. In town, voices still whispered of fortune-seeking, of a rancher blinded by loneliness. Some spat the word Maid like it was a brand of shame. Miriam bore it quietly, but Lucas saw the shadow it cast. She flinched when women turned away at church, when men muttered behind her back at the mercantile. One evening, she sat by the fire, shoulders curled in. "They'll never let me forget where I came from," she said. "They'll never see me as anything but the girl who scrubbed their floors." Lucas knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Then we'll build a life so strong it won't matter who refuses to look." Their bond deepened in labor as much as in love. Lucas took her, riding across the fields, teaching her the lay of every ridge and stream. She learned the cattle brands, the grazing rotations, the names of the hands who worked the spread. Miriam, in turn, brought small changes into the house, lavender tucked in drawers, pine boughs on the mantel jars of jam. From berries she gathered herself. The house breathed differently, no longer a monument to loss, but a living place. Even Mrs. Kettle, once sharp-tongued, softened, muttering girls, got the kind of sense that keeps a roof whole. Yet the land had its own way of testing hearts. One July, a drought fell heavy. Streams shrank, grass crisped, and cattle bawled with thirst. Lucas rode day after day, searching for water holes, bargaining with neighbors, digging wells that yielded little. Exhaustion carved his face, but he would not relent. Miriam watched him return each night, dust-coated and weary, and felt the old ache of helplessness. One evening she rose before dawn, took a spade, and went with two hands to a dry creek bed. Lucas found her hours later, hands blistered, dress streaked with dirt, sweat running down her neck. "What are you doing?" he demanded, half anger, half fear. "Helping," she answered simply, eyes fierce. "I won't stand by while you break yourself alone." His anger melted into something deeper, a raw pride tangled with love. He took the spade from her, and together they dug until water seeped dark and slow from the earth. It wasn't much, but it was enough to prove that even barren ground could be coaxed into giving. "You're stubborn," he told her that night as she bound his blistered hands. "So are you," she replied, smiling faintly. "That's why we'll survive." The drought eased, rains returning in late August with a violence that rattled windows. But the ranch endured, calves grown stronger, fields greening again. The valley, however, had not finished with its trials. Warren Pike, ever sour with envy, stirred discontent among men who disliked seeing a maid turn mistress. "Hale's gone soft," he sneered in the saloon. "A man who lets a servant girl sit at his table can't be trusted to guard his land." Words hardened into threats, mutters of schemes to test just how far Lucas's devotion went. One night, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Lucas returned late to find Miriam pale in the lamplight. "Men came to the porch," she whispered. "They said you were a fool to think you could keep me. They said I should remember what I am." Lucas's jaw clenched, fury burning through him. "You are my wife," he said. "That's what you are. And no man who doubts it will stand unchallenged on this land." Miriam's hand trembled in his, but her voice was steady. "Don't fight them for me. Fight them for us." As thunder cracked and rain hammered the roof, Lucas knew the storm outside was only an echo of the one building within the valley. The days of silence and running from grief were gone. Now he had something worth defending, and he would not let it be taken. The storm that rolled over the valley that night seemed to announce more than rain. Thunder shook the rafters, lightning carved the sky, and beneath it all, Lucas felt the old ghosts of grief mixing with a new fire he had not carried before. Miriam lay awake beside him, her hand pressed against his chest as if to remind him that the heart beneath still beat. "Don't go looking for them," she whispered when the rain eased. "Men like that want to be fed by anger. Starve them instead." He kissed her hair silent, but inside he knew he would not wait forever. Days later, whispers turned to acts. A fence line cut, a calf driven off and left half dead in the brush. Salt barrels overturned. The hands muttered about bad luck, but Lucas knew luck had nothing to do with it. Warren Pike's shadow loomed. He called the men together in the yard, rain clouds still clinging to the horizon. "Whoever thinks to test me should understand," he said, voice carrying. "This land is built on loss already. I will not lose again. Not cattle, not fences, not my wife." The words struck harder than any whip, and the men loyal to the wages, in the respect he gave them, nodded grimly. That night Miriam came to him in the office where the firelight carved lines across his face. "You've carried enough battles," she said softly. "Let this one fall away." But he shook his head. "They think your weakness. They need to learn you are my strength." She touched the sketch of Ruth and Eli, her finger brushing the frame. "Then fight in a way that leaves more than ashes. Fight like you want to keep this house full of life, not ghosts." Her words pierced deeper than any threat. 2 nights later it came. The dogs barked wild near midnight. Lanterns flared. Lucas grabbed his rifle, Miriam at his heels despite his order to stay inside. In the yard, 3 figures moved through the shadows, knives flashing in the lamplight. One slashed a rope, another kicked over a feed bin. "Enough!" Lucas roared, stepping into the yard, rifle steady. The intruders froze. Warren stepped forward, grin twisted. "Didn't mean no harm," he drawled. "Just checking whether the mighty Lucas Hale still guards his land, or whether he's too busy guarding his maid." Before Lucas could answer, Miriam's voice cut the night. "I am his wife." The words rang clear, unshaking, and stronger than she had ever spoken. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of rain on cooling earth. Warren's smile faltered. Lucas stepped closer, his shadow long in the lantern glow. "You'll leave this valley tonight," he said. "You and the others. If you step on my land again, you'll learn what steel feels like." His voice was low but carried the weight of truth. The standoff held until the dogs growled deeper, teeth bared. Warren spat in the mud, muttered a curse, and signaled the others. They slunk back into the dark, swallowed by storm and distance. Lucas lowered the rifle, his body still coiled like a spring. Miriam's hand touched his arm, steadying him. "They'll come back," she whispered. "Not if they know what waits for them." "Here," he answered, but his tone was less certain than he wanted. The following days carried unease. Riders spotted strangers near the ridge, smoke in places there should be none. Cattle grew restless, and the men worked double. Lucas felt the weight of it pressing heavier with each sunrise. Yet amid the tension, his love for Miriam deepened. She met the fear with quiet resolve, never flinching, always present. One evening, as they sat by the hearth, she leaned against him and said, "I used to think love was just kindness, a blanket on cold nights. But now I see it's also the courage to stand when the world would rather see you fall." Lucas tightened his arm around her. "Then we'll stand together." But the valley was not done testing them. A late frost swept down from the mountains, blackening shoots threatening the spring calves. Lucas rode out before dawn, determined to bring them in. By noon he had not returned. Miriam stood on the porch, shawl, tight eyes scanning the ridgeline. When at last a rider galloped into view, it was not Lucas, but young Tom, face pale. "Mr. Hale's caught up by the ridge," he gasped. Warren and 2 men cornered him. Miriam's blood turned to ice. Without thought, she seized a lantern and a horse, her voice shaking as she ordered Tom to rouse the hands. "Ride fast," she told him. "Bring them after me." She kicked the horse hard, wind tearing at her hair, the lantern swinging like a star against the dark. The road blurred beneath hooves, fear and fire braided tight in her chest. When she crested the ridge, the scene cut into her heart. Lucas stood, rifle broken from a blow, 3 men circling. His coat was torn, blood darkening his sleeve. Warren sneered, knife gleaming. Rich men bleed, same as beggars, he spat. Lucas met his eyes without flinching. Then you'll find I've got more blood to give than you've got courage to take. Before Warren could strike, Miriam's voice rang out sharp as steel. Stop, all heads turn. She sat tall in the saddle, lantern blazing. Touch him and you'll face every hand on this ranch, every neighbor with decency left. But more than that, you'll face me, and I will not break. Her defiance stunned them. Warren cursed, but hesitation flickered. In that heartbeat, hoofbeats thundered behind her. The ranch hands' rifles raised fury in their eyes. Outnumbered, Warren spat again and fled into the night, his men scrambling after him. Lucas staggered, but Miriam was off, her horse arms around him before he could fall. You shouldn't have come, he rasped. I had to, she whispered fiercely. You're not alone anymore. The ridge lay quiet after the clash, but quiet in the West was never true silence. It was the heavy breath that comes after a fight when men count what they nearly lost. Lucas leaned against Miriam, blood streaking his sleeve, his chest rising hard. The ranch hands fanned out, some chasing shadows, others circling back to guard their boss. The lantern swung in Miriam's hand, its glow trembling but unbroken. We have to get you home, she said, voice sharp with urgency. Lucas managed a faint smile through pain. You rode into a storm with nothing but a lamp and courage. If Ruth were alive, she'd have called you sister. The words struck deep. Miriam felt her throat tighten, tears pressing behind her eyes, but she forced them down. Save your strength, she whispered, guiding him toward the horse. The men lifted him up, careful, respectful, and the whole procession wound back down the ridge. At the ranch, Mrs. Kettle flew into action, hands moving with fury, scolding and binding wounds in the same breath. One man can run a herd, but not a valley, she snapped. Next time you think to meet knives with your skin, remember you're not the only one tied to it anymore. Lucas winced under the stitching, but nodded. I'll remember. The following days were a blur of healing. Miriam stayed at his side, washing blood from his shirt, spooning broth past his lips, holding his hand when fever tugged. Each night she whispered into the dark, not just prayers, but promises that he would not face battles alone, that the valley's whispers would not undo what they had built, that his strength was hers to carry too. Lucas listened, and though his body ached, his heart steadied. Word spread of the ridge fight. Some said Lucas Hale was reckless, others that he was a fool for letting a maid risk herself. But there were also voices that spoke different. The ranch hands told of Miriam's defiance, how she rode into the teeth of danger with nothing but fire in her eyes. The story grew reshaped by retellings until Miriam was no longer just the maid who became mistress. She was the woman who held the ridge with her voice. In a valley that respected courage more than wealth, that story began to change things. Yet peace did not come instantly. Warren Pike vanished for a time, but his bitterness lingered in the taverns, whispered promises of return. Lucas knew a reckoning still waited somewhere in the hills. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, he stood on the porch with Miriam at his side. They'll test us again, he said. Men like Warren don't quit when pride's been cut. Miriam's hand slipped into his. Then let them come. I was born to fear shadows, Lucas, but fear's just a chain. I broke it the night I saw you fall. Spring thickened into summer. Calves grew strong, fields shimmered with grass, and the ranch breathed easier. Lucas healed his scars, turning from pain to memory. He and Miriam worked side by side, branding, season haying long days, when sweat soaked their clothes, and nights when they collapsed in each other's arms with laughter instead of grief. In those moments, Lucas realized how far he had come from the man who once counted ledgers to drown silence. He counted instead the ways Miriam's presence filled the hollow places, her laughter over spilled flour, her stubbornness in the face of storms, her tenderness when she pressed her palm to his chest as if to assure herself the beat remained. But the valley still murmured. At a Sunday service, whispers followed them into the churchyard, tongues clicking about propriety and place. Miriam straightened her shoulders, chin lifted, and for the first time she did not shrink. Lucas caught the flicker of defiance in her eyes and felt pride swell. Later that evening, beneath the cottonwoods where Ruth and Eli rested, he took her hand. You've given me more than love, he said. You've given me back my name. Not the one stamped on land and cattle, but the one that means man, husband, brother. Miriam's eyes shone in the twilight. And you gave me more than shelter. You gave me a home. As harvest neared, trouble finally stirred again. A rider galloped in one dusk with word that cattle had been driven off near the southern ridge. Lucas saddled determination written in the set of his jaw. Miriam caught his arm. Don't face this alone. Let the men ride with you. He looked at her, saw the fire in her gaze, and nodded. Then we ride together, not as master and servant, not as husband and wife, but as Hale and Clark, side by side. And so they did. The posse rode under a silver moon, lanterns, bobbing rifles ready. The night smelled of dust and risk. Lucas felt Miriam's presence like a steadying hand, even when she rode behind with Mrs. Kettle's warnings echoing in her ears. They found the cattle penned by thieves' shadows scattering as the posse descended. Shots cracked, hooves thundered, and Lucas's voice cut through it all, rallying his men. When dawn came, the herd was theirs again, and Warren Pike lay captured, fury burning in his eyes but chains binding his wrists. The valley gathered to see him led away, some gloating, others silent. Lucas said little, only this land is not for men who take by envy what they cannot earn. We build with hands, not knives. The words rang louder than any bullet, and Miriam, standing beside him, felt the valley's eyes turn toward her, not with scorn but with respect. In the quiet that followed, Lucas and Miriam stood together on the porch. The ranch stretched wide before them, the cottonwoods whispering, the fields glowing gold in late summer light. Lucas drew her close. We've been tested, he said, by grief, by storm, by men who wanted to tear us apart. But still we stand. Miriam rested her head on his chest, listening to the heart that had once been hollow. And we'll keep standing, she whispered, tomorrow and the day after, until the valley forgets its doubts. Autumn slid across the valley like a slow tide, painting the cottonwoods in golden rust. The air turned crisp, carrying the scent of harvest and wood smoke, and the nights drew in earlier lanterns glowing in windows across the ranch like watchful stars. Lucas Hale stood on the porch, where once he had faced sunsets with only ghosts for company. Now he felt the warmth of another hand sliding into his Miriam's fingers, steady, her touch as natural as breath. Together they watched the herd move across the pastures, the calves grown strong, the men working with laughter instead of weary silence. The valley had begun to change its tune. Where once whispers had stung like nettles, now there was grudging respect, even admiration. Neighbors who once muttered about propriety now tipped their hats to Miriam, remembering the night she defied armed men on the ridge. Children ran to her when she came to town, eager for her gentle words and small candies she carried in her apron pocket. Even the sharpest tongues softened, not out of kindness, but out of recognition. Courage was a language everyone in the West understood, and she spoke it fluently. In the evenings, the house glowed with life. Mrs. Kettle fussed and clucked as always, but her eyes softened when she looked at Miriam, and she often muttered, "The girl turned this place from a tomb into a home." Lucas no longer buried himself in ledgers deep into the night. Instead, he read aloud by the fire, his voice steady while Miriam sewed or simply listened, her gray eyes calm. Sometimes he would catch her humming the lullaby she once said her mother sang, and he would close his eyes, letting the melody stitch together pieces of his heart he thought too torn to mend. Yet even in peace, the past lingered. Lucas often walked to the cottonwoods, Miriam at his side, to visit Ruth and Eli's resting place. He spoke their names softly, no longer with despair, but with gratitude. "You carried me this far," he would whisper. "Now she carries me the rest of the way." Miriam would place wildflowers at the foot of the stones, her lips moving in silent prayer. One evening, as the wind stirred the branches, Lucas turned to her, voice rough. "For years I thought my life ended here. Now I see it began again the day you stepped through my door." Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled, pressing her forehead to his chest. "We found each other in the ashes. That's where the strongest fires are born." As winter approached, trials came again, not of violence, but of nature. Snow fell heavy, fences buckled, and nights grew long. But Lucas no longer faced the season with dread. He and Miriam worked side by side, mending, feeding, warming, laughing, even as frost crept on the windows. In the darkest nights when the wind howled across the valley, they lay together, whispering small hopes for the future. Perhaps children of their own, perhaps teaching others that strength was not measured in land or cattle, but in compassion and loyalty. Spring returned soft and slow, and with it came renewal. Calves filled the pastures, streams sang with melted snow, and the house bloomed with life. Lucas planted a young tree beside the cottonwoods, his hands steady on the spade. For Ruth, for Eli, he said, and for us. So when the valley sees it grow, they'll know the Hale name still reaches toward the sky. Miriam placed her hand over his on the handle, guiding it deeper into the earth. Together they pressed the soil firm, sealing not just roots but vows. That night, as lantern light bathed the porch, Lucas held Miriam close. The valley stretched wide and endless. The same land that had once mocked him with its silence now sang with promise. I used to think tomorrow was just another day to endure, he whispered. But with you, tomorrow is a gift, she smiled, resting her head against him. Then let's keep unwrapping it one sunrise at a time. And so they did. No longer haunted by ghosts, no longer broken by whispers, they faced the wide west together, not as rancher and maid, not as man and shadow of grief, but as partners equals bound by a love tempered in firestorm and sacrifice. And in the quiet of that home, when the wind swept through the valley and rattled the windows, Lucas no longer heard emptiness. He heard laughter, soft words, and the steady heartbeat of a life rebuilt.